as we evangelize, we have to do what Paul did, become all things to all men. And I'm anticipating, as we say this, and I want you to explain that, but I'm anticipating a sort of pushback from very conservative-minded folks that would say, no, all we need to do is just preach the gospel. And by preach the gospel, what they mean is say the same words in the same way as works in my cultural context. What's the tension there? What's the danger they're worried about? And what's the pushback that you would have to that and say, no, we do have to contextualize?
Maybe a concrete analogy here. I meet a Japanese speaker on the streets of New York, and we're trying to communicate. My tendency, just intuitively, if I speak slowly and very loudly, I'm going to suppose he understands. I have to learn his language if we're going to communicate, or vice versa. He has to learn my language. And so unless you're willing to make the claim that there is one ideal language and I speak it, then the project of contextualization is inevitable. We all do it. We're not as all aware of it, but it's inevitable. And so I try to make a historical case. Many others have made. Tom Holland's wonderful book, Dominion, has made that case. The church looks different in different eras if we look back upon it. The church doesn't always look just like us. I opened up the book with this experience I had in a little village in southern Zimbabwe, and the worship experience was something I thought was from another planet. But somehow you realize these are brothers and sisters, though they worship very differently. They live out their Christian faith very differently, and yet there is something mysteriously in common. And I make the case it's that redemption we have in Christ, that it transcends our cultural differences, but doesn't obliterate our cultural differences. And so learning the language of our culture is imperative. And we have been slow to come to that realization, although I think we're making progress in certain circles, if you will. I mean, I think back to the two classic texts about unity and diversity in the early church, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, talk about differences in Trinitarian ways. But what's so interesting in both passages is the emphasis upon that which these differences actually have in common. They crescendo towards an affirmation of a one God, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, in the discussion about different gifts, in the discussion about, in Ephesians 4, different offices. So I think the New Testament is wrestling with an unmitigated diversity that is not restrained. Surely the early church was birthed in the midst of a deep polytheism of the Greco-Roman world, and they were very nervous about diversity becoming its own end. We live in a world obviously quite different than the first century, but many analogies, and others have drawn that conclusion as well. How do we relate to a deeply pluralistic, and in our instance, polarized world? Different because the Roman Empire exerted imperial control. We would like to have an emperor, I think, on occasion here in America, but the reality is we don't. But we still live in deeply pluralized times. And we, I think, have much to learn from the early church.